In January 1905, a massacre of protesters took place in St. Petersburg that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. Unrest soon spread across the Russian Empire in what came to be known as the Revolution of 1905. Along with Poland, Georgia was one of the regions particularly affected. In February, Stalin was in Baku when a spate of ethnic violence broke out between Armenians and Azeris. At least 2,000 were killed. Stalin founded the outfit, an armed revolutionary squad that were involved with armed robberies, racketeering, assassinations, arms procurement, and child couriering. According to Montefiore, Stalin socialized with hitmen Kamo and Sinsads, but issued formal commands to the rest of the outfit members through his bodyguard. Stalin also formed a Bolshevik battle squad, which he ordered to try and keep the warring ethnic factions apart, also using the unrest to steal printing equipment. He proceeded to Tiflis, where he organized a demonstration of ethnic reconciliation. Amid the growing violence, Stalin formed his own armed red battle squads, with the Mensheviks doing the same. These armed revolutionary groups disarmed local police and troops, and gained further weaponry by raiding government arsenals. They raised funds through a protection racket on large local businesses and mines. Stalin's militia launched attacks on the government's Cossack troops and Black Hundreds. After Cossacks opened fire on a student meeting, killing 60 of those assembled, Stalin retaliated in September by launching 9 simultaneous attacks on the Cossacks. In October, Stalin's militia agreed to cooperate many of its attacks with the local Menshevik militia. On 26 November 1905, the Georgian Bolsheviks elected Stalin and 2 others as their delegates to a Bolshevik conference due to be held in St. Petersburg. Using the alias of Ivanovich, Stalin set off by train in early December and on arrival met with Lenin's wife Nadezhda Krupskaya, who informed them that the venue had been moved to Tampere in the Grand Duchy of Finland. It was at the conference that Stalin met Lenin for the first time. Although Stalin held Lenin in deep respect, he was vocal in his disagreement with Lenin's view that the Bolsheviks should field candidates for the forthcoming election to the State Duma. In Stalin's absence, General Fyodor Gryazanov had crushed the Tiflis rebels. Stalin's battle squads had to go into hiding and operate from the underground. When Stalin returned to the city, he co-organized the assassination of Gryazanov with local Mensheviks. Stalin also established a small group which he called the Bolshevik Expropriators Club, although it would more widely be known as the group or outfit. Containing about 10 members, 3 of whom were women, the group procured arms, facilitated prison escapes, raided banks, and executed traitors. They utilized protection rackets to further finance their activities. During 1906, they carried out a series of bank robberies and holdups of stagecoaches transporting money. The money collected was then divided. Much of it was sent to Lenin, while the rest was used to finance Proletariat's BRD Zola. Stalin had continued to edit this newspaper and also contributed articles to it using the pseudonyms Koba and Basashvili. In early April 1906, Stalin left Georgia to attend the RSDLP 4th Congress in Stockholm. He traveled via St. Petersburg and the Finnish port of Hanger. This would be the first time that he had left the Russian Empire. The ship on which Stalin traveled, the Oyhana, was shipwrecked. Stalin and the other passengers had to wait to be rescued. At the Congress, Stalin was one of 16 Georgians, but he was the only one who was a Bolshevik. There, the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks disagreed over the so-called agrarian question. Both agreed that the land should be expropriated from the gentry, but whereas Lenin believed that it should be nationalized under state ownership, the Mensheviks called for it to be municipalized under the ownership of local districts. Stalin disagreed with both, arguing that peasants should be allowed to take control of the land themselves. In his view, this would strengthen the alliance between the peasantry and the proletariat. At the conference, the RSDLP, then led by its Menshevik majority, agreed that it would not raise funds using armed robbery. Lenin and Stalin disagreed with this decision. Stalin returned to Tiflis via Berlin, arriving home in June. For some time, Stalin had been living in a central Tiflis apartment owned by the Alalayev family. He and one of the members of this family, Kato Svanids, gradually developed a romantic connection. They married in July 1906. Despite his atheism, he agreed to her wish for a church wedding. The ceremony took place in a church at Tuskakaya on the night of 16th July. In September, Stalin then attended an RSDLP conference in Tiflis. Of the 42 delegates, Only 6 were Bolshevik, with Stalin openly expressing his contempt of the Mensheviks. On 20th September, his gang boarded the Tsarevich Georgy steamship as it passed Cape Coterie and stole the money aboard. Stalin was possibly among those who carried out this operation. Svanets was subsequently arrested for her revolutionary connections, and shortly after her release, on 18 March 1907, she gave birth to Stalin's son Yakov. Stalin nicknamed his newborn son Patsana. By 1907, according to Robert Service, Stalin had established himself as Georgia's leading Bolshevik. Stalin traveled to the 5th RSDLP Congress, held in London in June 1907, via St. Petersburg, Stockholm, and Copenhagen. While in Denmark, he made a detour to Berlin for a secret meeting with Lenin to discuss the robberies. Stalin arrived in England and Harwich and took the train to London. There, he rented a room in Stepney, part of the city's East End that housed a substantial Jewish immigrant community from the Russian Empire. The Congress took place at a church in Islington. He remained in London for about 3 weeks, helping to nurse Tuskakaya after the latter fell ill. He returned to Tiflis via Paris. After returning to Tiflis, Stalin organized the robbing of a large delivery of money to the Imperial Bank on 26 June 1907. His squad ambushed the armed convoy in Yerevan Square with gunfire and homemade bombs. Around 40 people were killed, but all of Jugashvili's rebel squad managed to escape alive. It is possible that Stalin hired a number of socialist revolutionaries to help him in the heist. Around 250,000 rubles were stolen. Service described it as their greatest coup. After the heist, Stalin took his wife and son away from Tiflis, settling in Baku. There, Mensheviks confronted Stalin about the robbery, but he denied any involvement. These Mensheviks then voted to expel him from the RSDLP, but Stalin took no notice of them. In Baku, he moved his family into a seafront house just outside the city. There, he edited 2 Bolshevik newspapers, Bakinsky Proletary and Gudok. In August 1907, he traveled to Germany to attend the 7th Congress of the Second International, which took place in Stuttgart. He had returned to Baku in September, where the city was undergoing another spate of ethnic violence. In the city, he helped to secure Bolshevik domination of the local RSDLP branch. While devoting himself to revolutionary activity, Stalin had been neglecting his wife and child. Kato fell ill with typhus, and so he took her back to Tiflis to be with her family. There, she died in his arms on 22 November 1907. Fearing that he would commit suicide, Stalin's friends confiscated his revolver. The funeral took place on 25 November at Kulubinskaya Church, before her body was buried at St. Nina's Church in Kukia. During the funeral, Stalin threw himself onto the coffin in grief. He then had to escape the churchyard when he saw Akhrana members approaching. He then left his son with his late wife's family in Tiflis. There, Stalin reassembled the outfit and began publicly calling for more workers' strikes. The outfit continued to attack Black Hundreds and raised finances by running protection rackets, counterfeiting currency, and carrying out robberies. One of the robberies carried out in this period was of a ship, the Nicholas I, as it docked in Baku harbor. Not long after, the outfit carried out a raid on Baku's naval arsenal, during which several guards were killed. They also kidnapped the children of several wealthy figures in order to extract ransom money. He also cooperated with Humet, the Muslim Bolshevik group, and was involved in assisting the arming of the Persian Revolution against Shah Mohammad Ali Shah Qajar. At some point in 1908, he traveled to the Swiss city of Geneva to meet with Lenin. He also met the Russian Marxist Georgy Plekhanov, who exasperated him. On 25 March 1908, Stalin was arrested in a police raid and interned in Bailiff prison. In prison, he studied Esperanto, then regarding it as the language of the future. Leading the Bolsheviks imprisoned there, he organized discussion groups and had those suspected of being police spies killed. He planned an escape attempt, but it was later cancelled. He was eventually sentenced to 2 years' exile in the village of Solvychegodsk, Vologda province. The journey there took 3 months, over the course of which he contracted typhus and spent time in both Moscow's Budyaki prison and Vologda prison. He finally arrived at the village in February 1909. There he stayed in a communal house with 9 fellow exiles, but repeatedly got into trouble with the local police chief. The latter locked Stalin up for reading revolutionary literature aloud and fined him for attending the theater. While in the village, Stalin had an affair with an Odessan noblewoman and teacher, Stefania Petrovskaya. In June, Stalin escaped the village and made it to Kotlas disguised as a woman. From there, he made it to St. Petersburg, where he was hidden by supporters. By July 1909, Stalin was back in Baku. There he began to express the need for the Bolsheviks to help boost their ailing fortunes by reuniting with the Mensheviks. He was increasingly frustrated with Lenin's factionalist attitudes. In October 1909, Stalin was arrested alongside several fellow Bolsheviks, but bribed the police officers into letting them escape. He was arrested again on 23 March 1910, this time with Petrovskaya. He was sentenced into internal exile and sent back to Solvychegodsk, being banned from returning to the southern Caucasus for 5 years. He had gained permission to marry Petrovskaya in the prison church, but he was deported on the same day, 23 September 1910, that he received permission to do so. He would never see her again. In Solvychegodsk, he commenced a relationship with a teacher, Serafima Koroshenina, and before February 1911 had registered as her cohabiting partner. She, however, was soon exiled to Nikolsk. He then entered into an affair with his landlady, Maria Kuzakova, with whom he fathered a son, Konstantin. He also spent time reading and planting pine trees. Stalin was given permission to leave Solvychegodsk in June 1911. From there, he was required to stay in Vologda for 2 months, where he spent much of his time in the local library. There, he also had a relationship with the 16-year-old Pelagia Onofrieva, who was already in an established relationship with the Bolshevik Peter Chizhakov. He then proceeded to St. Petersburg. On 9 September 1911, he was again arrested and held prisoner by the Okhrana for 3 weeks. He was then exiled to Vologda for 3 years. He was permitted to travel there on his own, but on the way hid from the authorities in St. Petersburg for a while. He had hoped to attend a Prague conference that Lenin was organizing, but did not have the funds. He then returned to Vologda, living in a house owned by a divorcee. It is likely that he had an affair with her. At the Prague conference, the first Bolshevik Central Committee was established. Lenin and Grigory Zinoviev subsequently proposed co-opting the absent Stalin onto the group. Lenin believed that Stalin would be useful in helping to secure support for the Bolsheviks from the empire's minority ethnicities. According to Conquest, Lenin recognized Stalin as a ruthless and dependable enforcer of the Bolsheviks' will. Stalin was then appointed to the Central Committee and would remain on it for the rest of his life. On 29 February, Stalin then took the train to St. Petersburg via Moscow. There, his assigned task was to convert the Bolshevik weekly newspaper, Zvezda, into a daily, Pravda. The new newspaper was launched in April 1912. Stalin served as its editor-in-chief, but did so secretly. He was assisted in the newspaper's production by Vyacheslav Skryabin. In the city, he stayed in the flat of Tatyana Slavitinskaya, with whom he had an affair. By May 1912, Stalin had returned to Tiflis. He then returned to St. Petersburg via Moscow, and stayed with Ng Poltev, the Bolsheviks' Duma deputy. During that same month, Stalin was arrested again and imprisoned in the Sh. Palarhy prison. In July, he was sentenced to 3 years' exile in Siberia. On 12 July, he arrived in Tomsk, from which he took a steamship on the Ob River to Kolpashevo, from which he traveled to Narum, where he was required to remain. There, he shared a room with the fellow Bolshevik Yakov Sverdlov. After only 2 months, Stalin escaped via canoe and made it to Tomsk by September. There he waited for Sverdlov to follow him, and the two proceeded to St. Petersburg, where they were hidden by supporters. In Tiflis, the outfit planned their last major operation. They attempted to ambush a mail coach, but were unsuccessful. After fleeing, 18 of their members were apprehended and arrested. Stalin returned to St. Petersburg, where he continued editing and writing articles for Pravda, moving from apartment to apartment. After the Duma elections of October 1912 resulted in 6 Bolsheviks and 6 Mensheviks being elected, Stalin began calling for reconciliation between the 2 Marxist factions in Pravda. Lenin criticized him for this opinion, with Stalin declining to publish 47 of the articles which Lenin sent to him. With Valentina Lubova, he traveled to Krakow, a culturally Polish part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to meet with Lenin. They continued to disagree on the issue of reunification with the Mensheviks. Stalin left and returned to St. Petersburg, but at Lenin's request, he made a second trip to Krakow in December. Stalin and Lenin bonded on this latter visit, with the former eventually bowing to Lenin's views on reunification with the Mensheviks. On this trip, Stalin also made friends with Roman Malinovsky, a Bolshevik who was secretly an informer for the Okhrana. In January 1913, Stalin traveled to Vienna, where he stayed with the wealthy Bolshevik sympathizer Alexander Troyanovsky. He was in the city at the same time as Adolf Hitler and Josip Broz Tito, although he likely did not meet either of them at the time. There, he devoted himself to examining the national question of how the Bolsheviks should deal with the various national and ethnic minorities living in the Russian Empire. Lenin had wanted to attract these minorities to the Bolshevik cause and to offer them the right of secession from the Russian state. At the same time, he hoped that they would not take up this offer and would want to remain part of a future Bolshevik-governed Russia. Stalin had not been able to read German, but had been assisted in studying German texts by writers like Karl Kautsky and Otto Bauer by fellow Bolshevik Nikolai Bukharin. He finished the article, which was titled Marxism and the National Question. Lenin was very happy with it, and in a private letter to Maxim Gorky, he referred to Stalin as the wonderful Georgian. According to Montefiore, this was Stalin's most famous work. The article was published in March 1913 under the pseudonym of K. Stalin, a name he had been using since 1912. This name derived from the Russian language word for steel and has been translated as Man of Steel. It was, according to Service, an unmistakably Russian name. Montefiore suggested that Stalin stuck with this name for the rest of his life because it had been used on the article, which established his reputation within the Bolshevik movement. In February 1913, Stalin was back in St. Petersburg. At the time, the Okhrana were cracking down on the Bolsheviks by arresting leading members. Stalin himself was arrested at a masquerade ball held by the Bolsheviks as a fundraiser at the Kalashnikov exchange. Stalin was subsequently sentenced to 4 years' exile in Turukhansk, a remote part of Siberia from which escape was particularly difficult. In August, he arrived in the village of Monastievskoe, although after 4 weeks was relocated to the hamlet of Kostino. Stalin wrote letters to many people whom he knew, begging for them to send him money, in part to finance his escape attempt. The authorities were concerned about any escape attempt and thus moved Stalin, along with Sverdlov, to the hamlet of Kureka, on the edge of the Arctic Circle, in March 1914. There, the Bolshevik pair lived in the izba of the Taraseva family, but frustrated one another as housemates. Stalin soon earned a reputation for self-centeredness among the locals when he simply seized the library of a deceased co-exile instead of sharing it in accordance to the exile's code. According to several of his biographers, including Stephen Kotkin, Ronald Grigor Sunny, Simon Sebag Montefiore, and Oleg Vkh Levniuk, Stalin had a relationship with Lydia Paraprigina at Kureka. At the time, Stalin was aged C35, while Paraprigina was about 13 or 14 years old. They had 2 children. In regards to the sources for these stories, Kotkin mentioned local villager Anfisa Taraseva and Lydia Paraprigina herself. Conversely, Kotkin noted that parts of the evidence of the events relied on reports gathered by Ivan Serov which contain obvious errors and reflect lazy police work. As per these tellings, Paraprigina gave birth to Stalin's child around December 1914, although the infant died soon after. As the incident became locally known, the police reportedly intervened and tried to force Stalin to promise to marry Lydia. He ultimately reneged on the vow. In 1916, Lydia, now 15 years old, was allegedly pregnant again. She gave birth to a son, named Alexander, in around April 1917, though Kotkin argued that Alexander's birth date was probably falsely recorded. Stalin, then absent, later came to know of the child's existence, but showed no apparent interest in him. The child would come to be known as Alexander Davidov, after Lydia's husband Yakov Davidov, who adopted Alexander. Within Paraprigina's family, stories were handed down about Alexander Davidov's origin, with Lydia herself claiming that Stalin was the latter's father. Decades later, Alexander's son Yuri Davidov conducted a DNA test with a recognized grandson of Stalin, Alexander Berdyansky. The test reportedly confirmed that Yuri Davidov was also a descendant of Stalin. In his later remembrances of his exile period, Stalin fondly recalled his dog of the time, but never mentioned Lydia or his alleged illegitimate children. Near the end of summer 1914, the authorities moved Stalin to Selivanica, where he was visited by his close friend Shurn Spandarian. Here, he lived closely with the indigenous Tunguses and Ostyak communities, with whom he went on fishing trips. He spent lengthy periods on Polovinka Island, where he constructed a one-man shelter and spent much time fishing in the adjacent Yenisei River. While Stalin was in exile, Russia had entered the First World War, but was faring poorly against the German and Austro-Hungarian empires. The Russian government began conscripting exiles into the Russian army. In October 1916, Stalin and other exiled Bolsheviks were conscripted, leaving for Monostiako. In December, they set forth from there to Krasnoyarsk, arriving in February 1917. There, a medical examiner ruled him unfit for military service due to his crippled arm. This was convenient for Stalin, as it meant that he would not be sent to fight on the Eastern Front, but also remained a source of embarrassment for him. Stalin was required to serve 4 more months on his exile, and he successfully requested that he be allowed to serve it in nearby Achinsk. There, he stayed in the apartment of fellow Bolshevik Vera S.H. Vaitzer. According to the transcribed recollections of a former Okhrana officer, Nikolai Vladimirovich Veselego, both Roman Malinovsky and Stalin reported on Lenin, as well as on each other, although Stalin was unaware that Malinovsky was also a penetration agent. Stalin was in Achinsk when the February Revolution took place. Uprisings broke out in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed, and the Tsar abdicated, to be replaced by a provisional government. In March, Stalin traveled by train to Petrograd with Kamenev. There, Stalin and Kamenev expressed the view that they were willing to temporarily back the new administration and accept the continuation of Russian involvement in the First World War so long as it was purely defensive. This was in contrast to the view of Lenin, who was still in a self-imposed exile in Europe, that the Bolsheviks should oppose the provisional government and support an end to the war. On 25 March 1917, Stalin returned from exile in Siberia to Petrograd with L.B. Kamenev and M.K. Muranov. On 15 March, Stalin and Kamenev assumed control of Pravda, removing Vyacheslav Molotov from that position. Stalin was also appointed as the Bolshevik representative to the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet. Lenin then returned to Russia, with Stalin meeting him on his arrival at Petrograd's Finland station. In conversation, Lenin convinced Stalin to adopt his view on the provisional government and the ongoing war. On 29 April, Stalin came third in the Bolshevik elections for the party's Central Committee. Lenin came first, and Zinoviev came second. This reflected his senior standing in the party at the time. Over the coming months, he spent much of his time working on Pravda, at the Petrograd Soviet, or assisting Lenin on the Central Committee. He lived with Molotov in an apartment on Shirokaya Street, where he and Molotov became friends. Stalin was involved in planning an armed demonstration of the Bolshevik supporters. Although not explicitly encouraging those armed supporters who carried out the July Days uprising, he partially did so by informing its leaders that "you comrades know best." After the armed demonstration was suppressed, the provisional government initiated a crackdown on the Bolsheviks, raiding Pravda. During this raid, Stalin smuggled Lenin out of the newspaper's office and subsequently took charge of the Bolshevik leader's safety, moving him to 5 safe houses over the course of 3 days. Stalin then oversaw the smuggling of Lenin out of Petrograd to Razliv. He himself left the flat that he shared with Molotov and moved in with the Alalieva family. In Lenin's absence, he continued editing Pravda and served as acting leader of the Bolsheviks, overseeing the party's 6th Congress, which was held covertly. At the Congress, Stalin was selected as the chief editor of all Bolshevik press and was appointed a member of the Constituent Assembly. Lenin began calling for the Bolsheviks to seize power by toppling the provisional government in a coup. Stalin and Trotsky both endorsed Lenin's plan of action, but it was opposed by Kamenev and other Bolsheviks. Lenin returned to Petrograd, and at a meeting of the Central Committee on 10 October, he secured a majority in favor of a coup. Kamenev nevertheless disagreed and wrote a letter warning against insurrection that Stalin agreed to publish in Rabache Put. Trotsky censured Stalin for publishing it, with the latter responding with offering his resignation, which was not accepted. On 24 October, police raided the Bolshevik newspaper offices, smashing machinery and presses. Stalin managed to salvage some of this equipment in order to continue his activities. In the early hours of 25 October, Stalin joined Lenin in a Central Committee meeting in the Smolny Institute, from where the Bolshevik coup, the October Revolution, was being directed. Armed Bolshevik militia had seized Petrograd's electric power station, main post office, state bank, telephone exchange, and several bridges. A Bolshevik-controlled ship, the Aurora, sailed up to the Winter Palace and opened fire, with the assembled delegates of the provisional government surrendering and being arrested by the Bolsheviks.